Greetings.
Part 8, Feralas and the Dragonscale Mastery. The green arrived before anything else. He was still in the grey margins of Desolace, the road south following the coastal terrain, the grey stone and grey soil holding their commitment right up to the point where they did not, when the green began its announcement. Not the green itself yet, but the smell of it, carried on the southerly wind with the generosity of a very large and very living thing, making its presence known across the distance that still separated them. It was nothing like the green smell of Mulgore, which was grass and open air and the sweetness of a plain that moved with the wind. This was something older, the smell of a forest that had been a forest for long enough that the being a forest had become a fundamental property of the place, rather than a description of what currently occupied it. Centuries of biological richness, soil that had been receiving the forest's contributions for longer than younger soils had existed, ancient wood and living canopy, and the particular note of things that grew in permanent shade, and had developed their own vocabularies for doing so. He stopped walking when the smell reached him and stood in the last of the Desolace grey, and breathed it in for a long moment. ASHWALLOW lifted his head and read the same air with the gold eyes, and the attention he brought to things that contained new information. Then they continued south, and the grey gave way. The transition was not gradual. One step, grey stone, sparse vegetation, Desolace maintaining its position right to the line. The next step, green. Not green in the measured way of a grassland. Green as a total condition, in more gradations and depths than he had previously understood the word to encompass. The canopy began almost at the border, as if the ancient trees had been waiting there. Not the partial shade of young growth, but the accumulated layering of centuries. Heights that required looking up, and then continuing to look before the sky was visible at all. The light that reached the ground was green-tinged and moving. Not the still light of an open sky, but the animated light of a canopy responding to wind far above, arriving at the forest floor, transformed rather than direct. The sound changed as completely as the light. Desolace had been near silent. Feralas was the opposite extreme, birds in the canopy producing a layered complex of calls at multiple registers, insects in the undergrowth adding their own, the wind in the high canopy arriving at ground level as a continuous presence that was the forest's response to wind rather than the wind itself. He stood in the first 100 yards and listened and looked and breathed, and understood he was going to need time here. ASHWALLOW in Feralas was a remarkable thing to watch. The white coat in the green forest produced something none of the previous environments had produced, not the simple contrast of white against ochre, but a colour existing in genuine relationship with what surrounded it. The filtered canopy light fell on the white coat and was changed by it, so that the white seemed to carry a trace of the forest's own illumination, rather than simply being lit by it. He moved through the undergrowth with the same absence of transition that had been his signature since the Barrens, the forest's three-dimensional structure, undergrowth and mid-level growth, and canopy all demanding simultaneous attention in a way flat terrain never had, and ASHWALLOW read all three levels at once, the gold eyes moving between them with the same comprehensive ease he brought to everything. He was, in the forest, entirely at home, differently at home than he had been in the Barrens, in the way that different places could express the same fundamental truth of belonging to the world rather than visiting it. The road south into the deep zone held to the forest's western reaches at first, the land rising on his right hand toward heights the canopy would not let him see whole. He walked it the way the forest seemed to ask to be walked, without hurry, with his attention distributed across the three levels ASHWALLOW had been reading since the first 100 yards, and made his first camp in a green dark unlike any dark he had slept in. The canopy holding the day's warmth down among the trunks, the night sounds layered and unfamiliar and requiring, like everything else here, their own vocabulary. On the second day the forest opened enough to show him what the heights had been concealing, two colossal peaks standing against the sky at a scale that made the ancient trees look brief, stone risen so far past the canopy that weather happened against their faces. The twin colossals, a traveller at Shadowpree had called them, in the tone reserved for things that did not require embellishment. Can stood at the edge of the open ground and looked at them for a long time. This was the far turning of a circuit, he understood. The deep south Rexar had named across the fire, the place where the Wanderer's road bent back toward Desolace and Stonetalon. He was walking the country of a man who had thrown an axe out of the dark for him, and the knowing changed the forest slightly, the way country changes when someone you owe has walked it first. Below the colossals, in the ruins the maps called Ravenwind, Harpies rode the updrafts with the proprietary confidence he remembered from the charred vale. The same shapes, the same patience, claiming a broken place the way such things always claimed broken places. He read their circuits from the treeline, adjusted his road to leave their ground theirs, and passed without incident, which he had long ago stopped experiencing as luck and started experiencing as the product of attention correctly spent. It was in the glade south of the ruins that he met the whelps. He heard them before he saw them, a sound like leather being shaken, many small wings without the softness of birds, and then the glade ahead of him was full of them. Creatures the size of a young wolf, green as the deepest canopy shadow, and shaped in a way that nothing else he had ever hunted was shaped. Not lizard, not bird. The fireside stories of his childhood had a word for the family, spoken always with the distance of things no one at the fire had seen. Dragonkin. Not dragons, the great ones belonged to stories older and higher than any fire he had sat at, but the family of dragons, the old blood carried down into lesser vessels, whelps and drakes and scaled hunters, creatures that wore-scale the way beasts wore-hide, and carried something in the eye that beasts did not carry. Two of them came at him without preamble, with the territorial fury of small things defending a nesting ground, and there was no reading his way out of it. The gun answered the first, and Etchaki ended the second, and the glade emptied in a scatter of green wings, and Can stood over the two small bodies with the specific weight he always carried when an animal died at his hand for no better reason than that it had been where he was. He did what he did with everything he killed. He knelt to take what the death could still give, so that the death would not be only waste. And the material defeated him. His knife knew hide had known hide since Camp Narek, through Yuna's training and a road's worth of practice, and the scale was not hide. The blade found no purchase a hide would have offered. The flensing angles he trusted tore what they should have lifted. The scales themselves, small and overlapping and green-black in the glade light, came away ragged where they should have come away whole, and beneath his hands, which had processed everything the road had given them, was a material that did not acknowledge anything his hands knew. He worked at it for the better part of an hour, with full attention, and produced ruin, and understood, kneeling there, that the failure was not a failure of care. It was a failure of vocabulary. There was a craft that knew this material, and he did not have it, and an animal had died into his hands, and he could not honor the death properly for lack of it. He kept a single scale, the marks of his ignorance legible in its edge, and buried what he could not use, and walked on with a question in his pack that weighed more than the hides did. The road bent east after that, and the forest center made its own demands. Ruins began to appear through the trees, night elven, he would learn later, and vast, towers standing out of the canopy at a distance the way the colossals stood out of the forest, and around them the ogres. He never saw more than their sign, and twice their distant shapes, and both times he took the reading seriously. Fires that burned careless and large, paths beaten wide through undergrowth that everything else in the forest moved through narrowly, the bones of kills left where they fell. He gave the whole territory the margin it demanded, made his camps cold on the 2 nights he spent crossing its reach, and kept Etchaki close, and the ogres remained sign and distance, which was the correct outcome for everyone involved. Nearer the forest's eastern edge, the sign changed again, gnolls, a people of them by the density of it, their trails crossing the road with the frequency of a population that regarded the road as furniture. One evening, their voices reached his cold camp from a distance he judged carefully and found sufficient, a yipping, overlapping argument of a language that carried through the trees long after dark. He sat with his back to a trunk, the gun across his knees, Etchaki a white stillness beside him, and listened until the voices moved off west and did not sleep deeply, and was walking again before the light had fully committed. He hunted as he travelled, because 9 days of forest asked to be provisioned from the forest, took what the pot required and nothing past it, and worked the hides in the evenings when the camp allowed a fire, finishing edges in the firelight below the colossals and again in the safer country east of the ogres. By the time the trees began to admit more sky, and the first worked timber of Tauren building showed through the green, his pack carried the road's whole accumulation. Baron's leather, Desolace hide, the Trek's additions, the worked pieces of a dozen evenings. and one green-black scale that he had not been able to stop taking out and turning over, as if the turning would eventually surrender what the material was withholding. It took him 9 days from the grey line to the smell of Tauren cookfires. It would have taken a less attentive traveller less time and cost him more. Camp Mojache sat in a clearing the forest had offered, and the Tauren had accepted, overlooking Wildwind Lake, the stream feeding through it with a current that gave the whole settlement a constant, quiet sound underneath everything else. The structures stood in relationship to the ancient trunks at the clearing's edges rather than in spite of them. The camp was fuller than its size suggested it should be. Tauren families had been arriving from the east for weeks, from Thousand Needles, he was told, and specifically from a place called Freewind Post. And Camp Mojache had absorbed them with the unhurried practicality it brought to everything, finding them space at the fire and work for their hands, and a place to set down whatever they had carried out with them. He spoke with several of them in his first days, not seeking the conversation but not avoiding it either. An older hunter named Tarka, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an injury he did not explain, told him plainly, the water came up where the water had no business coming up. Not rain, he said. Rain you can see coming. This came down the canyon in the dark with no sky behind it. He said it the way Grasswind had once described Duro, a person reporting something true and not yet fully metabolized. He did not elaborate further, and Can did not press, understanding that the not elaborating was itself information. That whatever had happened in Thousand Needles was recent enough and large enough that the people who had walked out of it were still finding the words for it in pieces. Can filed this the way he filed most things that were true and not yet relevant, present, available, waiting for the road to bring him to the place where the fuller account would be his to receive. He was the newcomer at Camp Mojache, visibly and without apology, the young Tauren with the broken horn and the red eyes, and the white lion who had come a long road, and had not yet established what his presence here meant. The community received him with the hospitality of people who had received others before, and developed a way of doing it. Welcome without effusion, an invitation to the fire without pressure, room to establish himself at whatever pace establishing required. Jangdor Swiftstrider ran the leatherworking supplies at the camp's eastern edge, and it was Jangdor that Can found first, simply because his stall was the first thing that smelled like his craft, and because a pack heavy with the road's hides was a thing to be resolved before anything else could begin. Jangdor was an older Tauren with the unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades provisioning other people's work rather than doing the deep work himself, and he went through what Can laid out on the counter piece by piece. The Baron's leather, the Desolace hide, the Trek's additions, the worked pieces made in the evenings of the road. It was the worked pieces he slowed down over. He turned a stitched seam to the light, ran a thumb along an edge Can had finished in the firelight below the colossals, and made the small sound of a merchant revising a price upward against his own interest. Good work, he said. The road does not usually teach seams like these. He paid fairly for all of it, and was already turning back to his stock when Can set the last thing on the counter. The scale from the glades below Ravenwind, the ragged marks of his failure still legible in its edge. Jangdor went still, in the way of a man deciding how much of what he knew to say. That is not hide, he said, and what you did to it is not the craft that does it. He looked up. There is a craft past hide craft. Scale work. Most leatherworkers live a whole life without touching it, and most who touch it learn only enough to ruin good material. He pointed across the camp toward the lake's edge. Hahrana Ironhide. She holds it here. I only sell what the teaching requires. He sold Can the materials he was going to need before Can had any idea yet what shape the need would take, which Can understood later as its own kind of confidence in what was coming. Hahrana Ironhide was at her workshop near the lake's edge, and she was not difficult to recognize once Can reached the door, a Tauren of significant age whose hands, when he first saw them, produced the same recognition Syra had first taught him to look for. Not large hands, smaller than his own, but hands that carried the permanent record of decades of intimate contact with one material, the kind of record that only formed when the contact had been genuine rather than occasional. She looked at him for a long moment when he arrived. Then she looked at Etchaki with the assessing attention that experienced Tauren gave to significant animals. Not the civilian wonder of something encountered unexpectedly, but a practitioner's read of something being evaluated for information. She said, "Show me your hands." He held them out. She looked at them for a long time, turning them, pressing at certain points with a precision that suggested she was reading something rather than conducting a general examination. She said, "Yuna trained you." "Yes," he said. She nodded slowly. "She is thorough," she said. "You have a real foundation." She set his hands down. "Dragonscale will ask something different of it than anything you have done so far." He said, "That is why I came." She studied him a moment longer, in the way of someone who had been making decisions about students long enough for the deciding to be rapid and accurate at once. "Come back tomorrow at dawn," she said, already turning back to her bench. "We will begin with what you think you know." What he thought he knew turned out to be, in Hahrana's assessment, a sound foundation and nothing more, which was a more useful finding than simply being wrong, because a foundation could be built on. She had not learned the scale craft here. That came out in pieces across the weeks, never as story, only as provenance attached to specific techniques. This hold she had from a master in the dry country far to the east, where the Dragonkin were older and the craft had grown old with them. That curing ratio she had corrected against his teaching and never regretted correcting. Can filed the dry country away, without knowing yet that the road would eventually carry him there. She began with the material itself. Dragonscale, she said on the first morning, comes off the animal the way hide comes off the animal, and that is where the resemblance ends. Hide is skin. Scale is armor the creature grew for itself, and armor does not tan. It is a different material that requires a different relationship between the craftsperson and the material. Not shaping a substance that accepts the shaping, but negotiating with a substance that has its own structural integrity and yields only to approaches that respect it. She showed him what this meant with her hands rather than her words, the approach to the scale's edge geometry, the way the material responded to different temperatures of curing agent, the tool angles that worked with the natural overlap pattern rather than against it. He worked through the morning while she watched, and when he finished, she looked at the piece the way she looked at everything, to see what it actually was. She said, "You have not yet felt what I showed you. You have only repeated it." She showed him exactly where the difference was visible in the work, where the technique had transferred, and where it had only been imitated. "Come back tomorrow," she said, and was already reaching for her own work. The second week she gave him a piece with a flaw built into it deliberately. A small inconsistency in the scale alignment, invisible to casual inspection, that the correct technique would reveal in the working, and the incorrect technique would simply work around without ever noticing. He found it on the third attempt, after 2 failed passes that produced technically adequate but structurally compromised results. Hahrana looked at the finished piece for a long time. "Most students take 5 attempts," she said. "Some never find it at all and produce work that fails later, in someone's hands far from here, for reasons they never trace back to this exact morning." He said, "Why hide it instead of teaching it directly?" "Because a flaw you are told about is a fact you hold," she said. "A flaw you find yourself is a capability you carry." She looked at him. "I cannot give you the second thing by telling you about the first." The third week she stopped giving him diagnostic pieces and started giving him real commissions. Armor components destined for actual hunters in actual conditions, the stakes of the work shifting from instructional to genuine. The first one he produced met her standard. The second one did not, and she told him precisely why, and he reworked it, and the rework met the standard the original had missed. "You are not yet fast," she said, when he completed the third commission inside the time she had allotted for the first time. "But you are no longer slow because you are guessing. You are slow because the work is genuinely demanding. That is a better kind of slow." The Dragonkin work began in the 4th week, once Hahrana judged his hands ready to process material under field conditions, rather than only the prepared hides she supplied for instruction. The mature Feralas Dragonkin, the grown kin, not the whelps of the northern glades, were formidable in a way that the dustwallow specimens he had heard described at a distance were apparently not, old forest predators with the authority of something that had occupied significant territory for a very long time. The accumulated confidence of generations, rather than the raw aggression of a young or contested population. He found his first true quarry of the scalework on a morning in the dense growth south of camp. In a clearing the dragonkin had apparently claimed for itself, the marks of its territorial behavior visible in the scarred bark of the surrounding trees, and the absence of the smaller creatures that would ordinarily have populated ground this rich. It was larger than he had expected from Hahrana's descriptions. The scaled hide a deep green-black that the forest light made almost impossible to separate from the surrounding canopy shadow until the creature moved, and the moving was the thing that gave it away, a heaviness to its tread that the undergrowth could not fully muffle no matter how careful the placement of each limb. He read it the way he read all things worth reading before committing to an engagement, the territorial boundaries it had marked, the pattern of its movement through the clearing, the moments when its attention was on the middle distance rather than the near ground. He marked the wind. He marked Mojache's position, already shifting without instruction to cover the angle that the dragonkin's blind side would otherwise have left open. The engagement itself was the kind that tested everything the road had given him simultaneously, rather than in sequence. He opened with the gun at the range the gun preferred, the shot finding the gap in the scaled hide that Hahrana's anatomical instruction, given almost as an aside, in service of teaching him where the best scale came from rather than where to strike, had told him existed at the throat's underside. The dragonkin's response was immediate and considerable, the kind of retaliation that came from something used to being the most significant thing in any clearing it occupied, and unaccustomed to having that assumption challenged. Mojache moved without being told to move, the white shape crossing the clearing with the dissolving blur that still, after all these months, registered as something closer to a change in the world's arrangement than an act of physical travel. He took the dragonkin's attention from the flank it could not turn quickly enough to address, and in the half-second that the attention was divided, Can closed the remaining distance with the axe and found the second gap that the first had opened. It was over in less time than the description required. He stood afterward in the settling quiet of the clearing, the small creatures beginning their cautious return, the canopy continuing its endless soft argument with the wind above, and felt the clarity that followed a clean engagement, the absence of waste that he had come, across the whole of the road, to recognize as a kind of moral as well as practical accomplishment. He processed the scale with the attention Hahrana had given him, and what came back to the workshop 2 days later was, in her assessment, the best raw material he had yet brought her. Hahrana sent him to the other workshop in the 4th week, which surprised him, because in 4 weeks she had not sent him anywhere. He had brought her a highland hide along with the scale, taken on the high ground west of the camp, good weight, well conditioned, and he had processed it the way he processed all hide, which was competently and by the method Una had given him on the middle rise. Hahrana looked at it for considerably less time than she usually spent looking at things. "This is not scale," she said. "It is not my material, and I am not going to pretend it is." She set it down. "There is a woman at the camp's southern edge who has been working the highland hides in this forest for 12 years. Take it to her. She will tell you what you did to it." Can said, "Is she a trainer?" "No," Hahrana said, already returning to her own bench. "She is a practitioner. That is a different thing, and in some ways the better one. A trainer teaches what the craft has agreed to teach. A practitioner teaches what her own hands have found out, which is written down nowhere and is not owed to you." She did not look up. "Be worth the telling." Syra Dawnweave's workshop was smaller than Hahrana's and considerably less orderly, and the disorder resolved, after he had stood in it a few minutes, into a different order. Everything within reach of the bench and nothing at all beyond it, the arrangement of someone who had stopped needing a room to look like a workshop and had let it become the shape of her actual working instead. She was Tauran and younger than Hahrana by a good margin, and she took the hide out of his hands before he had finished introducing himself and turned it to the light coming through the door. "Feralas Highland," she said. "Process dry." Can said, "Yes." She said, "Mulgore method. Whoever taught you well, and taught you for a country that does not exist here. In Mulgore, the air takes the moisture out for you, and your work is to stop it taking too much." Here the air is putting moisture back faster than you can work, and the same method that is careful in Mulgore is simply slow here. And slow, in this humidity, is a decision to let the material go a little further than you meant it to go. She turned the hide over once. This is not spoiled. It is a season shorter than it should be, and nobody will ever be able to tell you why. Including you. She handed it back. Come tomorrow, she said. Bring hands, not opinions. He came for 9 mornings, in the hours the workshop instruction left him, and what she gave him was not a curriculum. Hahrana taught in sequence, the way the craft was taught everywhere the craft was formally taught, each capability laid on the one beneath it. Syra taught by putting things in front of him and declining to say what they were. On the 4th morning, she gave him a finished panel of Highland leather and told him to find what was wrong with it. He found it inside a quarter of an hour, a compression along one edge where the stretching had been uneven, invisible, dry and unmistakable under the thumb, once the surface was warmed. Good, she said. Find the next one. He looked at her. He said, there is another one. She said nothing at all, which he understood correctly to be the answer. The second took him most of the morning. A variance in the curing depth across the panel's middle, so slight that he found it only by working the whole surface in strips and comparing what his hands reported back from each. When he named it, she nodded once and said, good. Find the next one. He said, I have found 2. Yes, she said. You planted 2. I planted 2, she said. He sat with the panel for a long time after that, and understood what she had done to him, and did not enjoy it, and recognized the not enjoying as the sensation of being taught something that could not be told to him. He found the 3rd on the 6th morning. It was not planted. It had come down out of the animal itself, a stress line laid into the hide years before anyone took it, from an injury the animal had carried and healed and gone on walking with, and it ran underneath everything he had already found, and it was the only one of the 3 that mattered, because it was the only one that would open later in someone's hands in weather. He put the panel down and said, nobody put this here. No, Syra said. Then how do you teach finding it? I do not, she said. That is the thing I have been making at you for 6 mornings. 2 floors can be planted, and a student can be trained to find planted things, and a student trained to find planted things will stop at 2, because 2 is the number he was trained to expect. She took the panel back and ran her thumb along the stress line without looking at it. The looking that finds the 3rd floor is the same looking that finds everything else that matters. It is not a technique. It is the refusal to stop when the answer arrives, because the answer arriving and the looking being finished are not the same event. Can was quiet. She said, you already do this. She said it flatly, as a fact about him rather than a compliment. You did it before you came here, or you would not have found my 3rd one at all. I am not giving you anything. I am telling you it is one thing and not several, so that you stop leaving it behind in the places where you do not already know you are carrying it. On the 9th morning, she looked at a piece he had processed start to finish without being told anything, and turned it once in the door light and said, exceptional. She said it the way she said everything, as the accurate statement of an honest assessment, with no investment whatever in how it was received. And then she handed the piece back and told him his elbows were too high, which they were. The Grim Totem found him on a morning in the 5th week, though it would be more accurate to say that he found evidence of them first, and the Grim Totem themselves only later, in a sequence that taught him something about the territory he had not previously understood. He had spent the previous evening with a wounded fairy dragon, one of the small, fragile-winged creatures of the deep forest that the locals called sprite darters, that had been favoured prey of something larger, and had escaped with a wing membrane torn in a way that would not let it fly far or long. It had not fled him, which told him how much the injury had already cost it. He had worked on the wing with the smallest tools the first aid kit carried, and the steadiest version of his hands, cleaning the tear and closing it with the fine stitching Syra's leatherwork had trained into his fingers years before either of them could have named what the training was for, and had released it at dusk into the canopy, where it rose in the unsteady, recovering spiral of something testing a repair and finding it sufficient. He He was following the direction of its flight the next morning, not for any reason he could have articulated beyond the habit of completing his understanding of things, when he came across a camp that had been recently and violently cleared. Not a dragonkin's territory. A people's camp, a fire pit gone cold, supplies scattered with the carelessness of looting rather than the order of habitation, and a single carved totem fragment broken, half buried in the disturbed earth. The fragment's carving style was Tauran. Unmistakably Tauran, and unmistakably not the style of any clan he had encountered on the road so far. Older in its forms, more aggressive in its iconography, the carved face on the fragment wearing an expression that Camp Narake's totems never wore. He stood with it in his hands for a long time. He found the survivor an hour later, in the brush a quarter-mile from the cleared camp. A young Tauran female, perhaps 15, with a shallow cut along her forearm, and the look of someone who had been running and had finally stopped because the body's capacity for running had been exceeded rather than because the danger had passed. She came up fighting when he approached, the way the man in Desolace had come up fighting, the same trained instinct of someone who had drilled the response into her body before she had fully chosen to need it. He held his hands open and away from himself and did not move, and after a moment that felt longer than it was, she stopped. He treated the cut with the sequence his hands knew without requiring direction. He gave her water. He did not ask immediately what had happened, because the asking would have been for his benefit rather than hers, and he had learned the difference between the two kinds of question. She told him eventually, in pieces, the way people told things that were still finding their shape. Her camp had been Grimtotem. She said the word with the flatness of someone who understood that the word produced complicated reactions in most Tauran who heard it, and had decided not to manage his reaction for him. They had been driven out of better land further south and had settled here, away from Camp Mojache's notice, until Horde agents working under orders from Orgrimmar had found them, and decided the camp's existence was itself the offence requiring correction. Can sat with this for a while. He understood in the abstract what the Grimtotem were. The rumours had reached even Camp Narake, the contested history of a Tauran tribe that had broken from the central authority of Thunder Bluff and Kayan Bloodhoof's leadership, that operated by its own rules in territories the rest of the Horde preferred not to claim too closely. He understood that the orders authorizing their hunting came from people he had no specific reason to doubt. He understood that this young woman in front of him, whatever her tribe's history, was simply a person who had been running from violence and was now sitting in front of him with a treated cut on her arm and nowhere obvious to go. He did not have a clean answer for what he was looking at. He held the absence of a clean answer the way he had learned to hold most difficult things, without forcing it into a resolution that the evidence did not yet support. He gave her dried meat and pointed her toward the deep forest west of the lake, away from both Camp Mojache and whatever direction the Horde agents had come from, and she looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite suspicion, the specific look of someone receiving help from a source that complicated rather than confirmed what she had been taught to expect. She said, "You are Horde." He said, "I am a hunter who found someone hurt." She considered this. Then she said, "That is not an answer." He said, "It is the only one I have." She left without further words, moving into the deep forest with the wary restraint of someone who had learned, recently and thoroughly, that the world required wariness. He watched her go and did not feel settled by the encounter, and did not try to force the settling, understanding that some things the road gave him were going to remain genuinely unresolved rather than merely unresolved for now. He told no one at Camp Mojache about it, not because he judged the telling dangerous, but because he had not yet decided what the telling would mean, and he had learned not to speak before the deciding was honestly complete. He fished the lake's edge on the mornings when the dragonkin work and the workshop instruction did not fill the hours before dawn, and Wildwind Lake spoke a dialect he had not previously encountered. The water fed by the stream that ran through camp, cold and fast at its inlet, settling into something slower and warmer further out, the two temperatures producing a boundary that the local fish clearly understood and used in ways his existing vocabulary did not predict. He built the new vocabulary the way he built all vocabulary, through patient attention to individual mornings until the pattern declared itself, then through testing the pattern against new mornings to confirm or revise it. He did not catch anything remarkable. He caught enough to eat, and he caught the satisfaction of a new water genuinely understood, which had become its own kind of currency to him across the road, separate from and equal to the currency the fish themselves represented. He walked to the outer walls of Dire Mall on a free afternoon, when the dragonkin work was done and the evening meal was hours off. The ruins were night elven, older than anything he had encountered, built by people who had worked on a different timescale than anyone who came after them, scale and craft that made the word outlast feel insufficient. He walked the exterior in the filtered afternoon light, the ancient stone holding the forest's warmth differently than the forest floor held it, releasing it slowly, the centuries audible in the way the stone behaved. He thought about the Kodo graveyard in Desolace, bones rising from grey earth, the dignity of things that reached their right ending in their right place. He thought about the broken totem fragment in his pack, which he had not yet decided what to do with, and about the young woman moving west into deep forest with nowhere certain to arrive. He thought about what survives when significant things end, and what the surviving says about what ended, and whether a people could be said to have ended at all, while individual members of it were still moving through the world looking for somewhere safe to stop. He stood at the wall for a while and felt the weight of being near something much older than himself, and found it, as he usually found such things, clarifying rather than diminishing. Then he walked back through the green dark toward Camp Mojache's fires, Mojache moving at his right side, reading the forest's evening. He left Feralas on a morning in the 6th week, 2 weeks longer than he had planned, and exactly as long as the staying required. Hahrana was at the workshop when he came to take his leave. She looked at his hands one final time, the assessment that mattered, the one that read what 6 weeks had actually produced in the only place Dragonscale instruction was ever finally legible. She said, "The understanding is in your hands now. Not your head." He said, "Yes. You will keep developing it from here," she said. "What I gave you is the foundation. The building from here is yours." She returned to her own work, which was the correct farewell from someone for whom the work itself was the primary thing. Tarka, the refugee hunter with the missing fingers, found him at the camp's edge as he was shouldering his pack. He did not say much. He had never said much in the weeks Can had known him, but he said, "If the road takes you west through the needles, you will see what I was trying to describe." He paused. "I hope it has settled by the time you reach it." "I do not know that it will have." Can said, "Thank you for telling me what you could." Tarka nodded once and went back toward the fire, and Can turned east toward Thousand Needles, the road ahead carrying whatever it carried, and whatever Tarka had walked away from now waiting somewhere ahead of him with the patience that difficult things always seem to have. From the thoughts of Can ASHWALLOW.
Hahrana said, "The understanding is in your hands now, not your head. I have been thinking about the difference between those two places. What lives in the head is available when the head is available, when the situation permits the conscious retrieval of what is known. What lives in the hands is available always. The way the first aid sequence my mother gave me is always available, not requiring retrieval, simply present below whatever the moment is doing to the rest of me. The Grimtotem girl. I have been turning this over since it happened, and have not arrived at a clean place to set it down. I do not know if I did the correct thing. I know I did the only thing the moment in front of me actually offered, a person hurt, in front of me, capable of being helped by what I had. Everything else about her tribe and its history and the orders that drove the Horde agents to her camp is a separate question, a larger one, and I do not think the larger question should have been allowed to change what I did about the smaller one directly in front of me. I am keeping the broken totem fragment. I do not know yet why, except that throwing it away felt like deciding something about its meaning that I have not actually decided. The two whelps below Ravenwind are the reason I am carrying this craft now, and I want that written down so I do not later remember it more nobly than it happened. I did not come to Feralas seeking scale work. I came to it because 2 small deaths happened at my hands, and I could not honor them, and the not being able to sat in my pack for 9 days and would not be put down. Hahrana teaches the craft as a craft. I am learning it as a debt. The fairy dragon's wing, the dragonkin in the clearing, the girl in the brush. None of them are the same kind of thing, but I noticed they all required the same first move, showing up to what was actually there rather than what I expected to be there, and giving it what it actually needed rather than what helping in general usually looks like. I think of Tama sometimes, here in this forest so far from anything she has seen. She would have opinions about all of it, the size of the trees, the smell of the place. A Tauren tribe she had never heard of camped somewhere she would have wanted to visit just to ask them questions nobody else had thought to ask. She would have made the forest talk back to her within an hour, the way she made everything talk back to her. I missed the particular shape of her attention, turned on something new. I have not had anyone to describe Feralas to, and have it become more real for the describing. I think of Camp Narek too, the red stone, the communal fire, my mother's hands in the leather. It is strange to be in a place this old and this green, and find myself thinking of a small dry settlement on the Mulgore plain. Perhaps that is simply what distance does. It does not erase the small places. It clarifies what they were. Taka said, I hope it is settled by the time you reach it. I do not know that it will have. Thousand Needles is ahead. I do not know yet what it will ask of me, or what it has already lost. Can ASHWALLOW